So, as you realise in this course, there's a lot of history, European history. The focus is upon political ideas, but insofar as the globalization of what comes out of Europe is very much predicated upon the fact that Europe has a particular historical trajectory. Now, if you did international politics with me, and even in my War, Revolutions and Terror near the end of that course, I do make the point that although a whole lot of our global institutions, the fact that we exist in nation states, for example, very much comes out of the European experience, it doesn't mean that that experience and the institutions that come out of it really takes root in the same way outside of the Western world as it does in the Western world. That's another big story, but we won't be going into that. The other reason I concentrate a lot on history is because I can't be sure that you know enough history to really understand why certain developments occurred, and that's something that I'm trying to get through. And in some ways, for example, when we're talking about the Renaissance and the Reformation, I feel that the myths surrounding, especially the Renaissance, and that has a lot to do with the way in which the Enlightenment thinkers understood themselves, and that then hence the post-revolutionary states and consciousness, post-French revolutionary states and consciousness, tend to buy into a certain mythology, which I'm trying to puncture. So, for example, when we look at the Renaissance, there's two aspects of it that I really wish to emphasize. One is that you simply cannot see it as primarily a secular event, even though when we look at Machiavelli, where we really see now a secular way of viewing political life, which we will talk about in some detail in this lecture, the fact is that is a gross oversimplification. And one of the reasons for that is that one way of framing the Renaissance is it's really a revolution that's going on initially, at least in Italy, and it comes out of a particular conflict, or it involves a particular conflict in which the role of the Pope, the Papal States, and indeed the nature of the Church becomes of seminal importance for the developments that are occurring in that time. And that's why I was mentioning the Gulf Ghibelline. I had actually always had it in this lecture rather than the last lecture. I remember getting in a real tiz about that at the end of the last lecture. And in part, my confusion comes from the fact, which probably leaves you a little confused, is that I'm moving backwards and forwards historically across this event that we call the Renaissance. And I'm trying to emphasize to you certain aspects of it which are often neglected in more traditional excursus through the history of political thought. So it would not be uncommon to jump from someone like Thomas Aquinas, who I really only mention in passing in this course, to someone like Machiavelli. And so one becomes emblematic, that is Aquinas, of the Middle Ages, and then Machiavelli becomes emblematic of the Renaissance. But the Renaissance is a whole lot of things happening in which the Church, and this is something I said last week, the importance of the Church and its role in society features significantly in a lot of Renaissance art. And I think I mentioned that if you go to any art gallery and you see a lot of Renaissance paintings, the thing that will most strike you is not how pagan-like they are, how secular most of the paintings are, but how frequently they have paintings of mother and child. Now, I've given two paintings here. one from Leonardo da Vinci, the famous Mona Lisa, you could say that's a very secular painting. This obviously is a religious painting. Now, in the paintings of the Renaissance, and indeed even prior to the Renaissance, one way, in fact a really important way, that communities bonded with the arts, which is to, let me put that slightly differently, that the role the arts played in the development of artistic processes from Romanesque to Gothic to much of the Renaissance, not all of it, much of it, is very bound up with the fact that the community is centered within the church, and it takes its bearing, its instruction from all the images and all the, this includes statues as well as paintings, the structure of the church. In a sense, the church is like, I'm going to use a very modern word which I don't really like in this context, but it's to drive the point home. The church is like an ideological center of indoctrination. It's a way of providing orientation, and the paintings are part and parcel of that. So it is typical in this period for pictures of mother and child to appear, that is, the Christ and Christ's mother. Now, the church is the mother, and the mother is emblematic, or a symbolic representation of the role of the church. We also mentioned, with that citation that I had at the end of the last week on the slide from Moses Torcusi, the importance that had taken place in the political transformation due to the development of city-states in Italy in this time, and I will come back to that. I'll talk about that at some more length. And that the landscape is very often indicative of actually a political transformation that has occurred. And this is a transformation which, in very simplistic terms, but it's not really wrong, but it's very simplistic terms, is a transition or a transference of political power not only into the cities, but within the cities that also affects the surrounding countryside, which is intrinsic to the breakup and breakdown of feudal relationships and oaths of fealty. That's a very, very significant point. So I think in both of these paintings, these landscapes are part and parcel of a consciousness which has redefined the political in such a way, or has extended it in such a way, that it's also able to draw in elements from the countryside that have civic rights and duties. And this is all bound up, as politics always is, it's all bound up with a transformation in the way in which resources are being extracted for political purposes. Which one of the most important aspects of any state formation is that it requisitions resources from one group to another for various projects and those peoples that are intrinsic to the perpetuation of the society through those projects, and hence for the political order is bound up with that. Wherever you are, and you have a state, that's one of the things the state does. Now, that's a structural aspect. I think I mentioned the difference between structure and culture. It's an important distinction. Just to repeat myself. Structure is, for example, the fact that, let's take a simple example of eating. We are structurally designed anatomically, biologically, so that we need. That's across the human race. But which food we eat, that's going to be cultural. Now, that distinction is a very important one when we think about processes of economic development, division of labour, authorisation of power, all of these aspects of social life which occur, and on a larger scale when we move from tribal societies to chiefdoms to the first states are really empires, but to states. Okay, and that's, again, that's a very common structural process. Having said that, there's often a seepage of culture into structure. So the extent in which a particular aspect of social existence has importance will also be affected culturally. That will also have a cultural effect. Now, when we look at the artists of the Renaissance, you can see they're contributing to the culture of the world in which they're participating. But as I said, one way of looking at that would be to just look at structurally at the role of religion in that society. And again, I may be repeating myself from an important point made earlier, but we moderns, and this is peculiarly, I think, a post-Reformation distinction, where, as we will see within the Reformation, the church as something visible that bonds the community together now becomes something of the interior, and it's ultimately about the spiritual relationships that are forged. And that changes the nature of the game. There's a dualism now is introduced, so that religion then becomes something that can be set apart from, because the question at that time is, what religion are you? Now, it's not that at different times that didn't also play a part, but it is as if religion now is purely a matter of choice. Even though it's not, even with the Reformation, it's not so simple, because we will see that they build communities around the choices that are made collectively. So there are collective choices being made, but ultimately we have the beginning of a certain individuation occurring within religion. Again, if we go back to the ancient world and the early Christians, we can see certain aspects of that already occurring. It's partly in the nature of Christianity itself why that can occur. But it takes on a whole other meaning in a world where secularization takes on significant importance, because the range of appeals, the range of arguments that are made, the kinds of intellectual choices that are made within the society start to recede from that archaic religious basis that, as I said, has been so ubiquitous to human experience. And this is also, which is one reason why those who argue like Burckhardt's a really great historian, don't get me wrong. I said I disagree in some fundamental ways with the way he depicts the Renaissance, and his work on the Renaissance is a real classic, and everybody should read it at some point in their life if they're interested in these things. Because one of the things that comes out of the Renaissance, and one way you can see this, if you go to St. Peter's Cathedral in Rome, or you go to any great Italian Renaissance church, what you notice is that there's a sense of individual artistry all over the place. It's as if the individual geniuses are competing with each other for your attention, so you will celebrate the artistry itself, not just the message behind the art. Now, this is, again, there's always, we can go back earlier and see tendencies within different artists to do this. But if you go, say, to a more Spanish-like church, I was in Andalusia and in Barcelona a few years ago, and it really struck me the way in which art was operating in those churches compared to Italian Renaissance churches. And it was all about that thing. In the Spanish churches, even though there's great works of art, don't get me wrong, but there's a sense of collective enterprise, a sense of unity in the whole thing. Whereas I think if you go to St. Peter's in Rome or any of these other great cathedrals, you're sort of spinning around at all the different things that are capturing your attention. Coming back to this point of genius, the artist as genius. This idea, by the way, of the artist as genius will be very important in the development of European culture. And it's why someone like Burckhardt notices that and therefore sees the Renaissance as a secular event. And he's right insofar as one thing is really true. I think there's lots of elements in the Renaissance which do have triggering effects, impacts upon a process of secularization. And again, when we look at someone like Machiavelli, there we can completely see it. But this is working itself over time. The other emphasis I want to make, and I'll come back to this, is because historians inevitably work with names of periods. So if you say, what are you working on to a scholar? I'm working on the early Renaissance. I'm working on the late Renaissance. I'm a medieval historian. I'm working on the Reformation. You can see the way this is all carved up as if these things are nice and clear and distinct. But of course they're not. Reality is a running mess of things, and trying to understand it, I think you're actually better off just accepting that and being very cautious with the nomenclature that is associated with the different events. Because it's not true that you simply go from the Renaissance to the Reformation. You know, that's the usual way. You go Middle Ages, Renaissance, Reformation, and then the next step. Enlightenment, for example. That's a common way of doing intellectual history. There's a whole stack of problems. But when we look at the Reformation, we will note that there's a whole lot of events take place which are hugely important, which precede that event that we call the Reformation, and are concurrent with the Renaissance. And in fact, the Reformation and the Renaissance are in many ways concurrent processes. It's just, they often get mixed up or separated chronologically, I should say, because it's easier to do it that way for the historian. But if you want to understand reality, facility and ease are not very good criteria for doing anything. And this is really a problem of the modern mind. One way, and when we look at Descartes, this will, I hope, be driven home to you. The modern mind is very much a mind about control. Controlling things, controlling nature, controlling morals, but in a sense the human being is elevated above the world in order to make sense of it. So that requirement of facility and differentiation and not looking at things too messy is part and parcel of a certain orientation to the world in which one is making it in a new way, in a novel way. That one is transcending tradition, in a sense, by leaping past it or over it and beyond it, to something that is more in keeping of the world we're trying to make with our mind. Again, I'm leaping forward here, but when we address those thinkers of the Enlightenment, you can see that's exactly what they're doing. They're mainly only interested in history insofar as it helps the project that they're operating upon. So they pick and choose. As I said, we'll come to that and we'll see that. Now, this idea of the elevation of the human will, we find in a famous work written in this high point of the Renaissance by a character called Pico della Mirandola. And it's on the oration of the dignity of man. Now, if we contrast what's being said here about the wonder, even though he couches it in terms of tradition, we can see how fundamentally different it is from Augustine or those early Christian thinkers, or even medieval thinkers like Thomas Aquinas and many others. So this difference, it seems to me, revolves around one specific thing. In a sense, I've already said it, the elevation of the will. But another way to phrase that so we can see the other point of view, and why the other point of view is quite a powerful point of view, is that the prior point of view, emphasizes dependency. It's not so much we ourselves what we do, it is what is bestowed upon us, the powers that are bestowed upon us, God's grace, miracle. It's another kind of language that is operative there. But the language, and again I always try to emphasize this to my students because my interest in religion is very deep, but it's primarily an anthropological, sociological, historical religion, because I think it tells us so much about what human beings are. And so the recognition of dependency is one which is ultimately, I think, broken with in this way of thinking. And there's other writers, other thinkers that start to emerge in time, and I think that in this sense, again, the secular importance of Renaissance art is part of the triggering of that process, because it does emphasize genius, brilliance. It elevates the mind. So I won't read that. You can read that. But you are all gods and sons of the Most High. This is the whole idea of the will, the genius, dignity, the dignity of man. Again, the word dignity, respect, words like that are very much part of our common parlance in political narrative today. Originally, I think they very much come out of this way of speaking, which is why also I don't think they figure so much in some other traditions, which is, again, the West, I find that the West is constantly short-footed when it comes to doing dialogue, intercultural dialogue, because it often makes assumptions about its own mindset, even when it's extremely critical of it in some ways. The criticisms that usually marshals are ones that are developed within the dynamic of its own evolution. Okay. Now, I'll just go back to the growth of city-states, so leaping back a bit. The Renaissance, this great transformation that occurred, required a process of urbanization, because it's within the city that you have the division of labour, the various craftsmen, and it is very typical when people live in the city, they take for granted the most important thing for their own survival, which is the food base. And I'll tell you what, any time there's a revolution, I know two of you are doing the revolutions course with me, you realise how fragile that is and what an issue that is when there's a real social breakdown. Then you can't take that for granted anymore. So we mentioned the de-urbanization process that came from these various conquests of Western Europe, and they started again around the 11th century. And this was also the beginning of independent republican cities. I think I mentioned this last week, or I may have mentioned in another course, forgive me, but the basis of the town is the marketplace. And the marketplace, the first thing that's there is excess food produce being supplied by those who work the land. And then they're looking to trade this for people involved in various crafts who could give them stuff for what they've got. So the marketplace is the centre, and then the church became the spiritual centre. And again, I think I mentioned this, you have wandering all over Europe, and it's astonishing, the story of how many people are wandering who are stonemasons, builders of cathedrals, with their various apprentices and looking for projects. So someone like Anselm of Canterbury is a famous theologian, writing, I think it's in the 11th century, if I recall rightly. He comes from Italy, spends time in France, and then ends up in Canterbury in England. He's a priest, not a stonemason, but there is a lot of travel that is occurring. And what's made it possible is the reurbanization process, and the reurbanization process is also given a big emphasis by having a spiritual core. Again, anthropologically, historically, sociologically, that shouldn't be such a surprise if we recall in the ancient world that the cities are presided over by gods. So that act of requiring higher powers to protect and then to ensconce various rituals and then means of forming social bonds within that collective group in that particular location. These are a very common structural feature of any kind of urban life. Now, it was in Pisa in the 11th century that the medieval consular form of government, the other thing that was happening at this time, I think I mentioned this as well, was the universities are beginning to come into place. And with the universities, you've got people, the primary three subjects that were taught in the universities were law, theology, and medicine. And you've got now all these different power centres, so there becomes a need for lawyers. And if we jump ahead, when we look at something like the French Revolution, we notice the role that lawyers play within that revolution. And this is to some extent true of the revolutionary conscience generally, of modernisation. Karl Marx was a law student. Lenin was a law student. And if we go back to the French Revolution, Danton, Robespierre, just one after another, the lawyers. But this is the beginning of it. When you're setting up these urban centres are being established, and as they define themselves in a whole new way, because they're no longer dependent, they're no longer caught up in that relationship of, I protect you, you provide the food, and I'll also come to you for recruits when I need it, and I'm a vassal of someone else, and that kind of tapestry of feudal relations. In the city, this is kind of breaking away from that. They still need protection, but now the citizens are able to gather together and create their own armed defence. So they become centres of wealth and trade. And again, this is a phenomenon you see in much more modern times, where countries move, which have been predominantly in the earlier part of the 20th century or mid part of the 20th century, which were predominantly agricultural, you'll see all these drifts into the city, which often creates a lot of poverty. Also, even those working on the land very often have a second job, going into the city to do stuff to get more resources. So here you also had, as I said, you had consuls, because in a sense, who's responsible for what goes on? You need to have rules and regulations, structural. So who is going to make that decision? Well, it's not like they were started by a king or was just founded. It's not like there was an obvious ruler already in place. So there is a republican feature to these city-states. Republic simply means res publica, thing of the people. And they were rotated. That was very interesting. And they did it pretty swiftly. One of the problems that would occur in the city-states, and this would occur for centuries, And it's a problem very much in operation when Machiavelli is writing 500 years later or so, well, not quite, but almost, where there's the problem of different families and groups taking more control in politics. Why? Because it's basically a patron-client relationship. Again, that's a very structural feature of human existence, and there's certain conditions where that's almost atypical. In fact, again, the West, the modern West, tends to, at certain other countries, I'm thinking of places in Southeast Asia, for example, or the Middle East, where you can see this patron-client relationship very much is operative in a system that is at work. And the West tends to use a word to describe that, and the word is corruption. That's corrupt. But when you're in that system, that's the only way you can operate. You have to do that. There's not really any other choice. You need a whole lot of other conditions in place, sociological conditions, where you can move beyond that. So by the end of the 12th century, northern Italy, there were a number of cities that were Republican self-governing. And then you had another problem, is that the Holy Roman Empire, remember me talking about the crowning of Charlemagne, the first Holy Roman Emperor, and how neither him nor his followers really were so happy about this, but that was all still very much apart. That was in a pre-urban, largely pre-urban, even though Charles had his centre in Aachen in Germany, but Charles the Great and his way of spreading justice in the empire was basically by a mob of people moving around on horses and dispensing it where it was needed, because they were predominantly working in pre-urban areas or non-urban areas. So what has happened is these are now a threat to the imperial order, which is very much still based upon feudal roots. See, there's something very tragic in this. Notice, there's nothing designed here. It's not the result of a group of people planning that if they do this, this and this and this. But again, the planning way of seeing things is so ubiquitous in modern thinking. You have a leader, you have a plan, get with the plan, you have a team, and we will enact that out, and that will all work out well. Well, this has just happened. So that brings us to the problems. And you know, what's an obvious big problem that could you think of one really big problem that the emperor would have with these independent city-states? And it comes back to this most structural, basic feature of state formations. Can anyone think what the problem might be? What will an emperor need? Really need? Must have? Soldiers. Yes. An army. Armies cost money. Here's a revenue stream disappearing before his eyes. Going, gone. Hell no. I don't like that. So what had happened is that a number of Italian republics had rallied around the Pope, who supported what was called this Lombard League against Frederick Barbarossa. He was defeated in 1176, but this thing was revived. It didn't just go away. And one of the reasons this Gulf-Ghibelline conflict goes for so long, Gulf being the papal party, It's very complex. It is so complex, and I'm astounded, actually, at how relatively little is written in English about this. I'm really quite astounded. For such an important event, you can find stuff, but compared to other events that have happened, which have been so important, you know, you'll find infinitely more on Roman history than you will about this, for example. But I think this is a really, really important aspect of the evolution of Europe and the development of Europe. So one of the complexities comes from the fact that whoever you've got leading the forces, you're going to have to pay revenue of some sort to. And by now, the Pope is operating with a number of states. So he's not just a spiritual leader, which was his, and this is actually, was just, again, it was something that just historically evolved. It wasn't just one Pope wakes up in the morning and goes, oh, I love all that land. It's when the Roman Empire had split to the east. That's basically what Rome was. It was a rump of territories where the Pope was presiding over these territories. Over time, remember me saying how it's in the 11th century that the papacy has this drive to clean up the church, and it's also directed against the Holy Roman Emperor at the time. That's where it really starts to try to centralise. And again, you recall the importance of the monasteries at Cluny, but how difficult it was to actually do. And it would, again, when we think of the Reformation, we think of the fracture of Christendom. But it took a long, long time for Christendom to be unified in a meaningful way before that. And there were always these forces of tension and breakage that were there. Even if at that stage, at the high point, the church looked like it held everything. There had been, you know, larger areas of schismatics, the Albigensians, for example, in the south of France. What was that, the 12th century, I think that was, but where they were, I won't go into it, but so there had been various schismatic movements, but essentially the story was one of the church becoming not only the predominant spiritual modality for bonding people together, which is important for any leader so they could trust their oaths, but they were becoming more centralized. But it was a very slow process. It was not like, and don't think it was like, simply the Pope said something in Rome and tomorrow over in Italy or Sweden, people were just doing it. It just wasn't like that. And the example I gave you earlier was the problem of married clergy, which is interesting because when we get to the Reformation, that becomes a problem, but it's completely viewed in a completely different way. It has a whole new frame of reference. And that's why the Reformers, as we'll see, they supported a married clergy. But they didn't support it for the reasons that clergy initially married and in the numbers that they did in Western Europe, and then was tried to be cleaned up by the papacy. And this is also one of the background theological important issues that people, scholars, philosophers at this time are writing about. Who ultimately has a final say in what should be done, in what a state should do? Is it the spiritual power or the terrestrial power? And again, I mentioned this last week, so I'm going over that ground again. So it was revived in 1226. It intensified in the anti-imperialist crusade. In 1250, Innocent IV had excommunicated Frederick II, so another momentary defeat of the imperial party, but this just keeps going on. It's not like it just stops. Because the imperial party is also a group of essentially warlords. principalities, powers, unified against another group that's unified. And that was a point I wanted to make earlier, and I moved away from it slightly. Even within the towns, it wasn't the case that a town that was working with the papal party was completely loyal to the papal party or completely unified. And different cities would change alliances. Again, that's very structural. That's a very common thing that happens in moments of war. When we look at, if we were to look at in any detail the 30 Years' War, which we don't, we'd see very similar kind of alliance changes that take place. It's depending what you're getting out of something at the particular moment. This would, as I said, really be one of the primary dictates of politics at that time. The other thing was that you had other really important hegemonic players, like the rise of the French monarchy, the rise of the Spanish monarchy. Again, Spain and the imperial party were very closely allied, the Holy Roman Empire. But France was something else, moving in a whole other direction. It would establish what's called the Gallic Church, which was looking for all sorts of ways to make itself relatively independent, especially in terms of revenue, not necessarily in terms of spiritual commitment to Rome. Now, one way, this is simplistic, but it does help, I think, orientate you, is that the Gulf Party, the Papal Party, tended to be more progressive. It defended this new kind of interest, the commercial burgher interest. Burg, from which we get the word bourgeois. Burg means living in the city. Bourgeois will become an incredibly important term when you get to Karl Marx. And people speak bourgeois this and bourgeois that. But at the time, the Ghibellines, much more feudal in a sense, noble pedigree. Your pedigree matters, not what you've done, but where you come from. Again, if you were to go back to ancient Rome or ancient Greece, your pedigree really matters. That's really part of traditional societies, including imperial society. That's very common. And there's a lot of reasons for that, but they're the kind of reasons that the modern mind tends to block out, cut out, or just be dismissive of. Of course, except when it's confronted with indigenous cultures that it wants somehow to cooperate with, then it will use a more romantic narrative around that. I find this one of the paradoxes and contradictions of the modern mind, of which there are many. And I think I mentioned Dante had come from Florence, and that was really complicated insofar as there'd been a civil war between the pro and anti-papal forces within the city, even though they were part of the same alliance as the Pope in another context. Dante would actually write, it's in the Divine Comedy, that great work I mentioned, and another work called the Monarchia, where he argues the case that there should be one emperor. And although the church should be there for spiritual purposes, anything to do with politics, that should be one, and indeed he envisages the emperor being a world governing power. Read this at your leisure. I think this is a really great little bit I got from the Catholic Encyclopedia. As you know, I put up the slides as well, so you can go to that. But I think that gives you a really good idea of the complexity, the factions that are occurring. And it is a time that is plagued by wars. Now, so the papacy now is a political player. As I mentioned Dante. Another major text in the history of political thought is Marsiglia of Padua's Defense of Tacus. And the issue, which is a really important issue in politics, it's one of those, if I was doing a more traditional political theory course, we would talk a lot about sovereignty, but it will be recurrent. Now, The question, so what do we mean by sovereignty? Who has the ultimate power of decision making? And another way you can look at that, and this was a formulation by a 20th century political or legal theorist, his name was Carl Schmitt. He's one of the great legal theorists of the 20th century, and he was a National Socialist. Go figure. Go figure. I don't think he was a great man, but his impact and influence was very big. And he defined sovereignty as he who decides in the case of the exception. That's how you find out who the sovereign is. Because very often, the way societies work is there's various office holders and they've all got their bit to do. And if the Constitution and the order is all working smoothly, there's not those kind of complex contradictions which require a sovereign decision to say, you live, you die, you go, you stay, this is done. So he, like Dante, was supporting the sovereignty of the emperor. We're going to talk about Thomas Hobbes next week, but I'll just say this. It's very interesting that Hobbes, whose whole work is really about the issue of sovereignty, and Hobbes is a really important political thinker. He says, that's endearment, the whole problem of the English Civil War, which if you know anything about it, and I might mention a few things about it in passing a little later in this lecture, but if you know anything about it, you would be likely to think this is completely deranged unless you knew more European history. But he says the English Civil War, the real cause of it, comes back to that investiture conflict between Gregory VII and Henry IV. Remember that? That was about who had the authority to appoint bishops. And as I said, this was a to and froing, and there was a concordance reached early in the 12th century. I can't remember the exact date, but it would be wrong to think that that meant it was decisive, it was over, it was all finished. This was just an ongoing problem and a contestation. So and it's still happening in 1300 when Dante writes the comedy. So in 1322, I think it's written. And one big conflict was also the conflict between Boniface VIII, who Dante puts in Hell, in his work, The Divine Comedy, and Francis Philip the Fair. That should not be the Fate, that should be the Fair. So it's Boniface's work, the Sanctum. And that again is an attempt to emphasize the sovereign power of the papacy over any other monarch. So Philip the Fair is beginning to try and concentrate power. He's building up a really centralized kingdom, just as will be happening in the United Kingdom, or Great Britain. England's still at that stage really, I suppose. So they're both centralizing, and in their own centralizing, one of the things they don't want to do, very understandably, is be taking their resources that they've got to defend the realm and to live the life they want, and doing that because they're making a big sacrifice. That's their own way of seeing it, and it's not wrong. They don't want to be seeing that money all going off to Rome, or large parts of that money going off to Rome. This would, in the case of Philip the Fair, this would lead to the papacy shifting to Avignon in France. It would be followed by what was called the Great Schism, and there would even be, at this time, there's a pope in Rome, there's a pope in Avignon, you've got different forces supporting the different papacy, so Europe is kind of all over the shop. This, if I recall rightly, it's a long time since I brought it, but this is all in the background to The Name of the Rose. A very famous book, not a very good film, but do you know it? Have you heard of that by Umberto Eco? That shows my age. About 30 years ago, it was the kind of book everyone had to read, The Name of the Rose. It was a kind of medieval detective story with a lot of history, and it's a very clever book. So I've just given you some of the claimants here, and the popes and anti-popes, but the point I want to drive home to you is how riven Christendom is at this stage. It's really riven, which is, ironic, because you could say at one level it's very unified culturally. It's much more important to focus upon the church and Christianity if you want to understand what's going on in Europe at that time, rather than ethnic groups. This is why, for example, there's a very famous book on Europe by Norman Davies. He tries to rectify this. It's a very, very thick book he wrote, about 20, 25 years ago or so. I think it's just called Europe. I've got a copy of it. And he is writing this very much like someone of his generation, of his time. So he's going back and looking at ethnicity and the importance of that. And I have to say, and he gives about 20 pages and all of that to the church. And you can see he doesn't like religion. He just doesn't like it. But I must say, I find the story very unconvincing because of how he does that. Anyway, read it yourself. You might disagree with me. But here's the thing. There's all these political conflicts going on, but there is a common culture. And in fact, the common culture has partly triggered the conflicts that are going on, because there is a common culture. By this time, too, so we're sort of now moving way ahead, but it would be wrong to say that the corruption of the papacy only begins with the Renaissance. I've spent some time reading histories of the popes, and you can go back to the 8th and 9th century where you find these families killing people to get their boy up in the papacy. So it does go back a long time. But remember, the church had been going a long time too before it even got that corrupt. But by the time that Machiavelli is writing, and by the time Luther steps onto the stage, so to speak, Rome is really pretty squalid. And although it's a kind of Hollywoodish crap version of it, it does play this up. If you see, there was a TV show done a number of years ago, called The Borgias. And that's about the Borgia family. And I mention them now because Alexander VI, who was the Pope, and whether they had lovers or young boys or, it was just, that was their world. He was the father of Cesare Borgia, and Machiavelli sees Borgia as a great hero, as someone to try and unify Italy. And this whole idea of unifying Italy, you can see from what I've been talking about, the Gulf and Ghibelline conflicts and different leagues and different civil wars that are going on. It's very understandable. And the French are in there as well, making conquests. It's very understandable why someone would want to write something that would try and put an end to the war and try and unify the Italian people, which is exactly what Machiavelli was doing. Now, by the time of the 14th century, many republics had come under the control of what we call the signoria. I mentioned that about the conflicting families, patron-client relationships. Dynasties start to form, family conflicts and faction. If you've seen Romeo and Juliet, the Capulets against the Montagues, that's the world of the city-states at this time. They're at war with each other. They'll be caught up in these Italian wars from the late 15th through the mid-16th century. I mentioned that would involve France, the Holy Roman Emperor. The Habsburg House was now centered in Spain. And Florence was under the control of the Medici family. They were great patrons of the arts. They were bankers. And it was around this time that capitalism really begins. And it just begins through merchants being able to, because the church had actually tried to forbid. In this, the Catholic Church, very similar to what Islam also still teaches, But at that stage, the Catholic Church taught that usury is sin. So they tried to get around this, and they succeeded in Italy. So in this very Catholic country, where you've got these very rich states, they're now trading with the Ottomans, and they're also, they will be behind people like Columbus and trying to extend world trade, because they're able to get people to make a loan on a shipment of goods, and then they'll make a profit on that. So that's really where it comes from, and the banking families are incredibly important, and they include the Medici are very important. They're also a very violent group. And when Machiavelli writes The Prince, he will dedicate that work to Lorenzo de' Medici. Okay, let's have a 5 or 10 minute break, and I'll be back. The wisdom of the world is the enemy of God. That's what Machiavelli is reported to have said on his deathbed. There's so many books written upon Machiavelli, and there's so many different ways that he is interpreted. Isaiah Berlin, a very prestigious historian of ideas, once gave a lecture in which he goes through 35 different ways to interpret Machiavelli, and that was written that lecture was given some 50 or 60 years ago. So what you're getting from me is very much my take upon Machiavelli. Some people try to Christianize him much more than I think he is, or to democratize him much more than he is. I think that Machiavelli is very much responding to circumstance that he is in, and I think he is absolutely unqualifiedly hostile to Christianity in terms of the culture that it creates. I'll clarify, I'll give you a passage later which seems to me to be bear that position up. There was one other thing I wanted to say there, it'll come back. So one of the things that Machiavelli is driven by, as I mentioned, is the desire to unify Italy and overthrow invaders. He was in exile from Florence, and he wrote this little book called The Prince, which is really a book about how to get power and how to keep power. It is not a book about what the good is, at least in the traditional sense. It is very much so, it also does provide a kind of rationale for a certain kind of human motivation which is intrinsic to the task he wants to undertake, the unification of Italy. And that is the importance of glory and the importance, really, of empire. He's dealing with principalities. But so here are some of the things that are key parts of the teaching. First of all, I wanted to make. So it's dedicated to Lorenzo. I think it was Voltaire that said it to Frederick, or it might have been the other way around. It might have been Frederick that said it to Voltaire. He said, if one of my subjects had written this book, I would thank him very much, I'd read it closely, and then I'd have them immediately executed. It is very much a raw look at power. It is, to use a phrase of Friedrich Nietzsche, who we talk about later in the course, a book that is in many ways beyond good and evil, but at the same time it sides with evil. It recognizes this. Machiavelli was seen as an important figure amongst Republicans, and we'll get to that in a moment, why that would be the case. But it's also, I think, want to make. It's also just important to keep in mind that when he's looking at the mechanics of power, and this is why he's sometimes called the first political scientist, that he treats it as a kind of technique, it's a kind of technology surrounding power. So one of the things that he says a prince needs to do is control his borders. And that, although he is using that in a geographical sense, it's also a statement about the way in which problems can befall you if you're not paying attention. So the other point I wanted to make is that was the case, but you've heard the term Old Nick as a term for the devil. That was an Elizabethan term. It was referring to Niccolo Machiavelli. So he was seen by many contemporaries, especially those that were in any way sympathetic to Christendom, which is the vast majority. He was seen very much as having a diabolical teaching. And again, in more modern renditions of Machiavelli, that's often brushed aside or explained away. I must say I find that quite unconvincing. I think Machiavelli knew that he was taking on the culture, and he thought politics, the wisdom of the world, is a diabolical terrain, and the God stuff only gets in the way. It just gets in the way, the Christian God stuff. Interestingly, I think his view of human nature is not altogether different from someone like Augustine. So he inflects it, this, Augustine, original sin, we basically are corruptible and corrupt beings. Not because God made us that way, because that's what we will inevitably do with our free will. We're always going to miss the mark in some way. Human beings are fickle, ungrateful dissimulators. They're weak, if they can be, and strong where they have an opportunity to pursue their own interests. So it is a world in which you can't trust anybody. And so the prince needs to keep this in mind, that today's friend can be tomorrow's enemy. And that those that say they are your friend, they will be until the going gets tough, and then they will get going. And you've got to deal with this. So how do you deal with this? That what you're working with are people, and people are pretty scummy. How do you deal with this? And the answer is, you've got to be brutal. And he uses the formulation, although it is good to be loved, and hence Machiavelli does give all this advice to the prince of various things they should do to stage the appearances, to make themselves act in such a way that it looks like largesse. It looks like you're generous, looks like you're loving to your subject. But ultimately, that will not take you far enough. It's better to be feared than loved. So you can have the steel fist in a velvet glove, but if the steel fist is not there, you're not going to be able to hold on to power. Indeed, he says this explicitly, the prince must know how and when to do evil. And he likens the instruction of the prince to the instruction of Chiron the centaur. There's a really interesting passage in the Prince read. And the thing about Chiron the centaur is he's half man, half beast. So anyone who is not half beast will be a very poor prince. Now, let me just say that we live in a time where very often political narrative is set up in a very idealist way. Rights, dignity, respect, blah, blah, blah. For Machiavelli, it is simply a fact that the kind of circumstances which principalities, and the same is true of republics, will find themselves within, which is why, and I'm going to say now, he's often considered in international relations theory to be a founder of a school called realism, which takes war and self-interest very much as the center of how we should look at states. So Machiavelli is focused upon the fact that if you try, or here's another formulation of his, if you try and defeat your enemies with holy water, you're doomed to failure. Moreover, and this is what gives his point of view a lot of leverage, if you fail, the bloodbath, and he's got all these examples that he can see, the bloodbath will be so great that you have not done your job. So his reasoning is, better a little bit of blood at the right time, cruelty at the right time, evil at the right time, and let's not pretend it's anything else. That's one of the great things about Machiavelli in this book is how plain spoken he is. Let's not gild the lily, as we say in Australia. Let's just accept the fact that if you fail, the consequences will be horrific. You're there to do a job. And if you don't do the job, then someone else should take your place, someone who will do the job. But your job cannot be akin to what a priest would do, or a philosopher would do, or someone working within the pure realm of ideas with pure ideals would do. That's why, I'll give you this example about staging appearances. He realizes, though, that if you're seen to be too cruel too often, not only will the people fear you, but they'll end up hating you. So that's why you've got to get this balance right. It's about this balance. And he gives a great case of how Cesare Borgia dealt with a character, poor unfortunate character, called Ramiro Dorco. And this is the story that Machiavelli relates. Cesare Borgia was presiding over a province in a civil war. And he used the services of this poor sap, Ramiro Dorco, to clean up the province. He did it, but he did it through butchery. He was untrammeled in the amount of violence he would do. He scared everybody. The violence was placated. Now what does Cesare Borgia then do? Does he just thank him and say, that's great, you know, you're on side with me? No. He cleaves him in half and puts him in the town square so everyone will see that anyone who ever rises up and causes violence in their province, this is how they will be dealt with. So damned if you do, damned if you don't. Another interesting aspect of Machiavelli, and I say this because we live in a world in which commerce is so intrinsic to its lifeblood and social reproduction, but he's very aware of, as are some other political philosophers, that a commercial spirit ultimately mitigates against a military spirit. And he sees this is a real danger. So he's aware of the corrupting influence. So he wants to ensure that within the principality that the prince is inculcating virtues of valor, taking those weak and fickle people, making them in some way dependent and grateful for their very existence upon the prince. But the end, and again, I'm somewhat astonished sometimes when I'm reading stuff on Machiavelli that the people writing about him don't always get this, even though it seems to be very obvious. The only end that Machiavelli can really offer for anyone, which is including the prince, for acting in this way, it's not money. It's not wealth, because that will ultimately bring you down. It's glory. And anyone who is familiar with Roman history would know the importance that glory had in the ancient Roman world. Your name, in fact, any kind of military imperial society is predicated upon the importance of glory. That's interesting, because I'm just going to make a quick comparison with Hobbes here. When we get to Thomas Hobbes, who's also someone that is called an early political scientist, because he too, there's a formulation by a character called Leo Strauss. It's a good formulation. He builds on the lowlands. And the idea is that we can contrast that to the classicists and even the traditional Christian political thinkers who start from the best, the highest. The ideas and ideals for the classicals, or the heavenly city for Augustine. Hobbes says, glory, what is glory but vain glory? It's a nothing. And I think it's symptomatic of a certain transformation that has occurred in areas where the military spirit is not so valorized now. Even though when Hobbes is writing this, he's writing out of the Civil War. And so in a sense, he's quite hostile to these martial forces gathering in groups and then fighting against each other. Now, he writes The Prince, but he also wrote a book called The Discourse on Living, where he basically is giving the same kind of advice to the Republic. And it is clear that Machiavelli prefers republics to principalities. And the big reason for this is the danger of a principality, and this is very insightful, is it's so dependent upon finding a good prince. Whereas in a republic, and especially the kind of, he's not talking of a commercial republic here, but in or a theological republic, as we'll see with the Calvinists, he's talking about what belongs to the people where the citizens are active, but they're active in terms of offering their military prowess, showing their courage and valor. And what he likes about the republic is it becomes a competitive system for people vying for that. But of course the problem is that a republic can very easily, and we have numerous examples historically, and I mentioned the Italian city-states where that can easily tip over into some kind of dictatorial rule, some kind of family dynasty ruling. But ultimately, he puts his money on this. He thinks that's preferable. And the other problem is he recognizes a prince may become envious of the best. But envy can come in all shapes and sizes and ways, can't it? Now, again, I won't read this, but I want you to focus upon this. Machiavelli attacks the Christian virtues as being feminine. So there's really no cultural role left for the sanctimony of Christian teachings. What he really would like to see, in fact what he believes is absolutely needed, is a revival of pagan, and by which he means Roman, military virtues. And he gives the example of sacrifices of beasts and getting one's hands dirtied in the blood of the entrails of the beasts for sacrifice, as inculcating a spirit that is true to the things of the world, and that is the visceral character of life and the visceral requirements for a successful military power block. And that's ultimately what this is. It's a successful military power block. And he basically thinks the thing about empires is empires are doing one or two things. They're expanding or shrinking. We're in a world where we can see empires or large centralized states in operation, and if we don't become centralized, if we don't become unified, we are vulnerable. So we need an ethos, not one which glorifies the humble, the weak, but men of action. Strength of body and strength of soul. Bravery. Not adept at suffering, but achieving great deeds. Again, if you look at that, you can see. Now this also is connected to a very important term, virtue. And this is the Italian virtù. Virtue, you recall, is exactly what the classical thinkers were basing everything upon. You recall that with Socrates, the virtue they initially were inquiring into in the Republic was justice. And you will also recall that he thought you didn't really understand justice unless you understood the idea of the good. And because of the primacy of the idea of the good, then you could understand the way the virtues related to each other and what was needed in order to bring about a concordance of soul and a concordance of city. This is not what Machiavelli is talking about when he's talking about virtue. It is purely energy and will. So, if you like, he's using a traditional term and giving it an antithetical meaning. That is not an uncommon thing. Hobbes will do something very similar when he talks about law. Ideals are delusions easily used to bring about your downfall. Along with glory, I should have mentioned patriotism. You need to inculcate patriotism and all that, and that's exactly what the Romans did as well, of course. Political life is constant struggle. I mentioned conquer or be conquered. You could say it's realist, there's an imperialist logic. Be careful of overreach. It's pragmatic. And also, but what is also factored into the mix is fortune. Now, fortune was a trope that was very common in the medieval period and in the idea of the wheel of fortune. Sometimes you're up and then you're thrown down. And in the Renaissance. He basically says, fortune is a woman, she needs to be conquered. Remember what I said about the will and that, and I gave you that Oratio on Dignity by Pico della Mirandola. This is a very similar way of thinking, but now it's applying itself to practical affairs. Now the dignity is glory. Glory and patriotism. But a bad prince, a bad republic, is one which will not know how to recognize the moment with which to grapple with fortune, how to grapple with fortune, what to seize in the proper moment. So, with Machiavelli, we see this pagan component within the Renaissance, and it's being used to drive out the Christian. Now, he was not a solitary, isolated thinker in this respect. There had been, remember me talking about Petrarch running around looking for different books in libraries, wanting to discover more about the ancient world. One of the things that have become now much more common knowledge. See, one of the things Lorenzo de' Medici was doing, by the way, was paying people to translate books. Books that had long since no one had known about. They might have heard of the name. So Plato, for example, is being paid by Lorenzo. I think it's Lorenzo doing the payment. De' Medici is paying Machiavelli Ficino to translate Plato. They were also very interested in alchemical works, works of ancient magic, and in fact, even the way Plato was read then was sort of a compound of this classical worldview with the more magical and mysterious world. That's something I think it's really important to remember about the Renaissance as opposed to and even in its pagan dimension, as opposed to the Enlightenment thinkers. They very still, and you could say in some ways this is in common with the medieval, except the Christian bit's gone away, I suppose, in this, what I want to say. But the forces of night and the forces of day. And the forces of night, magic, alchemy, these are intrinsic to the Renaissance mind. And if you read a lot of Renaissance thinkers, you'll see how caught up they were in this kind of material, which, again, when we get to the Enlightenment, most of it, no, I say that, Isaac Newton, the great scientist, and we're going to talk about the scientific revolution in a moment, maybe we'll get to it by the end of the day, but we'll probably be stuck on the Reformation, so it'll be in the next week. Isaac Newton spent a lot of time working on alchemy. So this was a very long pedigree. You all know what alchemy is. You basically find a base metal and you transmute it into something higher. Now, in spite of Machiavelli, despite a revival of the pagan gods, and this is starting to also, you're starting to see more mythological paintings. This had been earlier. So it precedes Machiavelli. It really is part and parcel of what the humanists are doing because they see the glories of the ancient world, and then you've got people like Machiavelli come along and say, not only was that ancient world glorious, and really, for us, much more interesting than what Aristotle is doing. You know, he's just doing logic chopping. Who needs that shit? But what is the spirits? What spirits had activated this? So, I'll give you another example. I'll talk about him a little later again, but Rabelais, the great writer of Gargantua and Pantagruel, a very important book in its time. So that's written in about the middle of the 16th century, so some 50 years after Machiavelli has written The Prince, 50, 60 years later. And he wants to see a revival of the god Pan. And again, he is making an attack upon Christian traditions. And indeed, although there were many Christian humanists, Rabelais, in my view, very mistakenly, is often treated as a Christian humanist, and there are books doing this. I don't agree with them at all, but you can make up your own mind if you ever read him. The attack, though, that the humanists are tending to make, and it's a common attack, is especially upon the monastic life. They really attack that. And the monastic life, the breaking with the monastic life will be central to this period that we're going to call, or that is called, not we're going to call, the Reformation. Okay. Now, I just want to, the thing you notice about the Renaissance and Machiavelli, it's coming out of Italy. The influence spreads beyond Italy, that's for sure. That's no doubt. So you can talk about the Renaissance existing outside of Italy, but that's where the soul of it comes from. And that's where all the great Renaissance thinkers you can think of, maybe someone can correct me and say, what about this person? I go, I forgot them, but they're coming out of the Italian experience. The experience in Northern Europe is somewhat different. And that's, I think that's where we're going to go now. Yes. What say about the Reformation? There's a lot of truth. But the Reformation is very much liberty in the more modern sense. Now, obviously, there's a democratic aspect to the republics from the urban centres, but when we speak of modern democracy, we're not only generally speaking of a political structural program, we are inevitably talking about a certain culture or ethos that is intrinsic for a modern style democracy to work. Now, having said that, I don't want to oversimplify this. I don't want to suggest that somehow the one was latent in the other. If, for example, or when, for example, we look at the spread of reformist ideas, it's true that that will have a huge impact upon what takes place in France, which will subsequently have a huge impact upon the French Revolution, via the religious wars and the persecution of the Huguenots. Those of you that do the revolutions course with me know that it's a whole set of contingencies are operative which actually bring about the transformation. It's not just an ideational move. It's not just, or to put it another way, because we're doing a kind of history of political thought course, I'm looking at history, but I'm also looking at the ideas, and I'm wanting you to focus upon the transformation of ideas, their evolution. But that evolution is a very complicated and contingent affair. It's not just a logical affair. But having said that, I agree with this character. I can't remember who said it. He's not alone in saying it. Basically, this is how Wilhelm Hegel, not so much talking about democracy, but certainly liberty, sees the issue in his great work on the philosophy of history. Now, the interesting thing, I'll call this the beginning of the end of Christian society. The Reformation plays a part, and as happens all the time, a number of unintended consequences are unleashed. And they will feed into the scientific revolution. I'll put the Reformation and the scientific revolution as kind of bookends. So the scientific revolution is opening up the path to the Enlightenment. But it is a kind of bookending which lends a certain degree of truth to this statement. So, remember me saying about the Reformation and the Renaissance being very, in large part, concurrent for a lot of the times. So, the roots of the Reformation very much go back to conflicts between the German emperors and the papacy. So much so that it's really a reigniting of that conflict that is ultimately behind Luther's success as a reformer, and indeed the survival with his very life as a reformer, because he's being backed up by German princely powers. Many of the things Luther says have long been known as problems within the church. Much of what he says is not that novel. It's the context in which he says it and part of the alignments that he makes. Dante had criticized in the Divine Comedy clerical abuse. He had attacked simony, the buying of office, spiritual office, and indulgences, basically buying your way out of hell, paying with earthly currency for the sins you may have done, or you have done, or you may do in the future. And indulgences especially will be very important when Luther takes his stand. And at this stage, the church, through the desire to build this great Basilica of St. Peter's, is on a mission to get as much money as it can, as much revenue as it can, to help the project. And they've got great artists, including Michelangelo, who's working on that. They've got to pay. So, we also go back earlier 14th century, and this is going to be very important, and this is to do with the translation of the Bible. And that is also something that has an unintended consequence. So, why are you translating the Bible? Well, you're translating the Bible so that you yourself can read what the Holy Book is saying. Once you can do that, why do you need these officiators to guarantee that you're doing it correctly? Now, Protestantism will keep a clergy of a sort, but it's fundamentally different. And to what the Catholic Church is, even though, again, if we jump ahead to I haven't got it down there, but I'll just mention this. There had been what was called the conciliar movement going on in the 15th century, which was very much operative around the idea that clergy were spiritual representatives of the community. Not the leader, but the representative. That's really important. So it had been John Wycliffe and the Lollards who had emphasised the translation into English. He was anti-monastic. He was anti-papist. He was critical of the idea of transubstantiation, that is, that God himself becomes present in the Eucharist at the moment that the blessing takes place within the Mass. He had attacked church-owning property. He had already identified the idea of the invisible church of the elect. Remember what I said before? The Renaissance, the building of St. Peter's in Rome, that's all about the church visible. And all that communal stuff that is happening in the Middle Ages is all about making the Spirit, the majesty of God, visible to everybody so they can live in fear and trembling, and they do the right thing and they save their soul. All these messages that are built into the windows and the stained glass windows and the statues surrounding the church. There had also been a revolutionary outbreak in the 14th century which had also attached themselves to the name of Wycliffe, and ultimately he was declared a heretic and his body was exhumed in 1415. So the issue of heresy is a big one. It's happening in all sorts of other ways as well, but this is particularly pertinent to the Renaissance. The fact that France and English crown had harboured monarchical ambitions against the papacy was also something, I think, that fueled a certain distance within Christendom between certain political powers and the papacy. Now this is very interesting because France would stay Catholic, but as I mentioned earlier, it would really stay Catholic even though there were a lot of Protestants would be there, and ultimately they would be persecuted, many killed, exiled, or what was also very common, just forced to keep quiet until they managed to regroup and rebuild. Whereas England would very quickly after the Reformation break with Rome, but Henry VIII fancied himself as a theologian. And I think his arrogance or ego, and he had actually received recognition of his theological importance. I can't remember, it was a medal or something like that, but from the Pope in his early years before the break came. But I think in this respect, he really did fancy himself as being able to resolve the theological issues of the day. I think his ego combined with his appetites was absolutely fateful for England, because breaking with Rome in the way he did But not siding with the reformers left a big incubating problem. In Central Europe, Jan Hus continued Wycliffe's attacks upon the church. He was found guilty, in spite of the emperor supposedly protecting him, and he was burnt at the stake in 1415. Now, an event like the execution of because a character like Jan Hus is symptomatic, in a sense he's an emergent property of a specific community with a specific set of grievances. So you've martyred someone that's, like Wycliffe, has identified all these issues that are wrong with the church. They're trying to save the faith. They're appealing to a collective with which we're enormously popular, and you've killed them. The idea doesn't stop with the execution. You've just bought yourself some time. But in buying yourself time, if you can't completely extinguish the problem, it's just growing and incubating. It'll come back. So this is very much in the mindset of someone like Luther. He's aware of this. And this happens all the time. This is, in a sense, one of the things that history is. It's the sequential stamping of certain events upon human consciousness. And some events are going to be stamped very much in the minds of other people. It's like a tattoo on the brain. And it will be having efficacy long after the immediate representative. So Hus is representing something. His own death is not the issue, not really. Now, one of the things, I've mentioned the humanists, and I'll come back to them, because one of the most famous humanists, in fact, if anyone could mention two really famous humanists, it would be Petrarch and Erasmus. Erasmus is a slightly older contemporary of Luther. It was said of Erasmus that he had laid the eggs hatched by Luther. And he was a ferocious critic of monastic life. He basically thought people who lived behind the cow are scoundrels. And the humanists were going around saying that what's going on in the monasteries, it's sexual licentiousness, and the other thing was, now this is a very important point to keep in mind. At this stage, the clergy was a major economic force. It was a major economic force. And I'm not just talking about the wealth of the church. It was a great big employer. So this was a place where you could survive. And there might be various reasons why you end up in a monastery. You might have been an illegitimate mother. Or you might have been caught having sex and the family wants to get rid of you, even if you're not a mother. But there's all sorts of reasons. Or you don't have much of a future elsewhere. You're not going to be a good soldier. But there's real opportunities in the church for you. And of course, the way it's structured is that there are some positions which are very lucrative, but others where you will survive. And survival. No one guarantees our survival. That's part of fortune. So in one way, and it's Dearman McCulloch in his book on the Reformation, he's a very good Irish, I think he's Irish, theologian and historian of the church. He likens it to a great big trade union, the church. I think that's a terrific analogy, because essentially what that makes us keep in mind is that the Reformation is an absolute threat to economic agency of a lot of people. And at the same time, we will also see that its very existence brings about an economic transformation in those countries where the reform has taken place. And in Germany, nuns and priests who leave the monastery will all go out into the world to adopt professions. Now, the immediate moment that brings about, it's Luther that is really the flashpoint. And then we start to see a number of other figures. But as I said, it's not the novelty that he introduces, because that's already, the criticisms are very familiar. It's where he makes it, and when he makes it, and the forces he can get to support him as he makes it. Luther was an Augustinian monk. He couldn't stand the scholasticism of the church, and he couldn't stand the corruption of the church, especially, as I mentioned, with indulgences. He nailed on the church at Wittenberg, and you can still visit this church. It's probably been rebuilt, it was probably bombed, but I went there a number of years back. The theses, what's called the 95 Theses. And these were meant to be a provocative challenge of a debate. At one stage, he even debated Luther on the question, Erasmus on the question of free will. Erasmus ultimately wanted to stay with the church because he believed that the unity that the church had created was far more valuable than what he would see as a breakup of the world of Christendom. And Erasmus was right. The founding of national churches, is the beginning of a whole new way of doing business, which is the formation of political power into nation states. But the nation churches are what they are predicated upon. This visibility versus invisibility, I just emphasize this, that in this dispute, Luther emphasized that his theological position was one in which it was salvation through faith rather than works. There's nothing basically that we can do that will ensure our salvation. So this idea of predestination is very common throughout the Protestant world. And especially in Calvinism, this idea of the elect. God knows who the elect are. So there's something about that you can see as a bit of a problem intellectually. Well, why should we do what we do? But it's a little bit like clinging onto a raft, I think, at sea. That's all we can do, is have faith and pray. And Luther himself thought very few Christians would be saved, because he thought that Christian, he says it, a great formulation. Luther is a fantastic writer. He says, struggle, struggle, cross, cross. That's the life of the Christian. Luther was also a very visceral and earthly character. He couldn't stand the sanctimony, and this becomes more and more evident as the reform starts to take off. But he couldn't stand the sanctimony that was all part and parcel of the church visible stuff. All these, saints at prayer and looking into the future thought this was just a load of rubbish. It was just terrible. And he thought the Christian life was hard, and he thought any spirituality is of the interior. And I'll pick that up because that has a huge development upon European art, especially in its Calvinist inflection, which is more radical than in Luther. The tensions between the Holy Roman Emperor, led by German princes, between the German princes and which were part of the Holy Roman Emperor, I should say, but Charles V in Spain was the Habsburg Emperor at the time. It was a very complex system of election of who would be emperor and of the roles and responsibilities. But basically, they were sick of the Italian wars against France, and they just put it bluntly. So, Frederick III, the Elector of Saxony, guaranteed to be Luther's protector when Luther was supposed to go to Rome to defend his case, and he probably wouldn't have come out alive. There's a good chance of that. Now, I mentioned the Bible being translated and a Bible in every home. This was not only an idea of Luther. Once there was success, so once his religion had taken off, this had become very much reality. The printing press just happened to have come into existence, or the movable printing press had come into existence just around this time, so he could actually achieve this. So here's an irony. What you've done is you've created a much more literate population than you ever had prior to that. One reason that people weren't reading the Bible, apart from the fact that it wasn't really encouraged at all by the Catholic Church, is people couldn't read. They were illiterate. So, and in fact, this issue of translation of the Bible would be well into the 18th century in Italy that was still, or in the various principalities in Italy, that was still absolutely forbidden. So this was a very big issue, because it also touched on another point, which I mentioned before, and passing, I'll say it again, is the role of the priest as mediator between you and God. But if everything is internally of the Spirit and of faith, then that is between you and God. So it's not that religious communities are going to disappear from the Reformation. They have a different function. They're basically a place where you go to pray together, share in the Spirit together, to encourage each other, but not to receive some kind of wisdom or doctrine that you couldn't figure out from yourself in the Bible. I mentioned the monasteries, nunneries being Luther's stand was also supported by a lot of the peasants, but they had their own grievances against the agrarian landlords, or against their landlords. And they were really in serious revolt, and they had hoped that he would support them. But Luther's fear of civil war, again, if you read his work against the peasants, is absolutely blood-curdling. And Luther was very capable of writing. He writes some blood-curdling pamphlets against the Jews as well. Initially, the Jews had supported Luther, and he had been supportive of them, but that would change. He would see them as a real problem. And some people have argued that Luther is an important source of the anti-Semitism that would weave its way through Germany. I'm not so sure of that. I think anti-Semitism has a long history in the church, or anti-Jewishness had a long history in the church. Luther was still of a piece with those Christians that wanted to solve what would later be called the Jewish problem by conversion rather than annihilation. So I think that is a big difference, that modern anti-Semitism is very much predicated upon race theory, and that's nothing to do with it. Certainly elevated the hymn and German music, and that would be a big part of the Lutheran tradition. And again, I think that has a big impact on the spread of music as an art form, and it also impacts upon the courts and classical music. I think there is a connection. There would be a long story between the Luther's approach to music and why Germany becomes such a bastion of classical music. Also, many of the monks and nuns would find employment in the university. Of course, not all of them by any means. But the idea then of the professor at the university was someone to express what would be the conscience of the spirit and ultimately help form the national consciousness. Finances came from the community. They weren't going to go to Rome anymore. So this is another factor that feeds the prospect of a nation as opposed to the supranational entity that the church had hoped for. The clergy could marry. We recall that had been, the Catholics were doing that, and that had always been part of the Orthodox tradition. And there were various sacramental reforms which reduced the sacraments to baptism, a Reformed Mass, and the Eucharist, and there were also various theological disputes about the nature of the Eucharist. I won't go into them. There was also a major aesthetic transformation. In the case of Luther, there's a general, as I said, there's a general tendency to be critical of church visible. So where does art figure in the church? Luther is somewhat equivocal. He doesn't want it dominating, but he's not a complete iconoclast. Whereas the Calvinist churches in Switzerland, I'll talk about Calvin next week, that the Calvinist churches would just be a whitewashed waltz. So one of the consequences of the Calvinists, and you will recall that what we now call the United States, not through Canada, but the United States especially, is focused on that. It's founded by Puritans, and the Puritans are the English Calvinists. So Calvinism has moved up through Western Europe into Holland, and then into Scotland, and then down into England, and then makes its way to the United States. There's a whole new aesthetic, because if you're a craftsman and you can paint, it's not that you shouldn't do that, it's just that's got nothing to do with depicting God's majesty, because God's majesty can't be depicted. So the artists and artisans are using their skills, the subject matter transfers to everyday life. Again, that's why if you go through Dutch art galleries and you look at paintings from the 16th and early 17th century, you'll notice it's all about everyday life. Whereas the Italian Renaissance, although there's some things like the Mona Lisa, the whole emphasis is very different. It's symptomatic of an aesthetic transformation that has occurred. I'll do one more. I will. I'll just quickly say this. If you look at that map, you realize how quickly the transformation is occurring. We look at it here. You've got Zwingli in Zurich. There's an attempt to bring these together. We've got Calvin, who we'll look at, especially in Switzerland and southern parts of France. There's an attempt to get a united Protestant front, tries to bridge the different reformist doctrines together. It doesn't really work. And in fact, as the religious wars occurs, you often find Protestants fighting Protestants. So whether you're Lutheran or a follower of Zwingli or a Calvinist can make a very big difference in the community that you're part of. And I mentioned that Henry VIII, in his desire to get married, had used this as an opportunity to basically conquer the monasteries. There was a land grab, get hold of wealth, and stop paying taxes to Rome. And he could get a divorce thrown in. And as he needed, a couple more divorces as well as a few executions, which he probably could have done the executions gratis. But he was not a reformer. So have a good look at that map. That's a really very helpful map, and you can see how quickly it's changing. Now, I'll say one last thing about Luther. Because Luther's support base was very much dependent upon the princes, and we said, so when the peasants revolted against princes in Germany, he wasn't on their side at all, even though they thought he would be. Luther, as a political thinker, he's a Christian, he's anti-Roman, but he's not that radical in terms of politics. So he's not really bringing in a whole new style of politics. Next week we'll start off talking about Calvin, and we will see with Calvin we get the basis not simply of a republic, because we already saw that with the city-states, but of a particular kind of republic that requires having a spiritual core and citizens be in a certain way, which is, I think, very much at the basis of the modern Republican faith consciousness, which has its roots in religion, but then moves beyond religion, but retains something of the religious character in the way it views morality. Thank you.